The next topic is a continuation on why does flow matter, and this um, reason is very interesting to me and is part of the reason why I started looking into the subject. And the reason is that flow matters because it's relevant in in what it means for skill acquisition and the mastery of a skill. Okay, in the book The Rise of Superman, Stephen talks about how the world of extreme sports, of adrenaline sports, was pushing the limits of what was humanly possible, and did so in a period in a period of the last 20 years. So, firstly, he says that athletic performance has been linked to evolution for most of our history. Our ancestors, the performance of our ancestors was very similar to the performance of their ancestors, um, and so on. Progress has been slow. Um, a a daughter at her peak physical age could not outpace a mother at her peak physical age, and the mother couldn't outpace her mother, both of them being in their peak physical age. We didn't see we didn't see people improving the vertical jump, say, by 1 foot in a generation. Progress was slow. But in the world of adrenaline sports and extreme sports, as Stephen says in the book, things have been different in the last 20 years. Progress has been um, progress has been rapid. So in his his talk at Google, Stephen says that in the 90s he started working in the action sports arena because at the time there was lots of work to be found there. The X Games was starting up, and it was and yeah, and there was lots of work to be found. And what would happen was, because he wasn't a professional, he would and was working on these. No, sorry. So he was working um, around these sports, these action sports, and because he wasn't a professional and he was taking part, a professional athlete, he was getting injured. So he would take a few months off and come back to the sport. And he said that each time he came back, the what the athletes were doing would have improved markedly. They what they were able to do, they would have made improvements on and iterations on those improvements, and he was just astounded at the progress they were making. So he then goes on to give this example. He says that surfing is an roughly 1,000 year old sport, and from 1480 to 1996, there was very slow progress. The biggest wave you could surf was a 25-foot wave, and he says there were physics papers written about how you couldn't surf a wave bigger than that. Then from 1996 until now, people began surfing 100-foot waves. Um, and that's an example of how in the last 20 years there was such rapid progress in the realm of surfing. I'd like to add something here, which is that I'm sure that well, I don't know a lot about surfing, but I could guess that there might be other factors involved in that progress. I know that for big wave surfing, they use jet skis to take the surfers out to the where the break is, and also that the surfboards, the material used to make the surfboards changed, I think in the last 30 years. And I'm sure the board design changed too. So I think there were also other factors, but it still is a nice example that he gives. The rise of Superman, he gives another example in the world of motocross. He says how up until 2002, the backflip on a motorbike was deemed impossible. Scientists and athletes thought there was no ways it was possible given the aerodynamics and the weight of the bike. But then in 2002 at the X Games, both Travis Pastrana and Mike Metzger landed backflips. Then in the next few years, they added heel clips. They did the backflip one-handed, then no-handed, then without feet, and then they did the trick off-axis. And 4 years after the 2002 X Games, Travis Pastrana landed a double backflip. So Stephen uses this as another example of how progress was rapid in the world of extreme sports, and he does cite some other examples. There's an example with skiing, the world record in skiing, which I think increased by about 100% in in roughly 12 years, and he gives other examples in big air skiing and in snowboarding. So he does give many examples. I won't go into them. I guess it's in a way it's up to you whether you accept his argument for the fact that there was rapid improvement in the world of adrenaline sports there has been in the last 20 years. I think that going into some of the examples, to me they seem like there can be you could say that there are various variables that that should be taken into account. But I think it becomes a persuasive argument when you look at all the different sports that this rapid increase in what the athletes were able to do. When you look at all those examples, the argument becomes persuasive. Okay, so I've spoken about how Stephen describes the rapid improvement and acceleration in what the athletes could achieve, the rapid improvement in achievements, and and how these athletes were pushing the limits of what was possible in the extreme sports world. So now, in the book, The Rise of Superman, Stephen talks about how there are 3 paths to mastery, 3 commonly accepted paths to mastery. Okay, so the first path is known as the mother's idea. So there was this study done in 1980 by Benjamin Bloom, where he looked at 120 people under the age of 35 or 35 and under in the fields of tennis, swimming, sculpture, piano, mathematics, and I think neuroscience. And he looked at people who had reached significant accomplishments in those fields. And he wanted to figure out how did they gain that success? How did they get to these levels of mastery? And his theory at the time was that what he would find was exceptionally talented children performing astonishing feats at a young age, that because of this, went on to succeed in their various fields. But what he actually found was that these these people came from environments where at least one close family member was served as an encouraging force. They were motivated, they showed encouragement. No, sorry, they were encouraging when signs of talent were showed, and discouraging or they ignored signs of the opposite. And to the contrary of what Benjamin believed or had thought was the case, that he didn't find any exceptionally talented children. Okay, so that's the one idea and the key to this idea is that successful people who reach mastery in a field, come from nurturing, encouraging backgrounds, and so they get motivation to reach these heights. But if you look at extreme sports athletes, many of them didn't. Many of them came from dysfunctional and unencouraging backgrounds. Many of them came from broken families and bad childhoods. And many of the sports that fit into the extreme sports world, you were labeled as an outcast for doing them. Think of surfing and even skiing. So they don't seem to fit this route to mastery because some of them would have come from encouraging backgrounds, but many of them wouldn't. So this rule that you should come from an encouraging, motivating environment can't be the deciding factor for mastery. Okay, so the next widely accepted route to mastery is based on this idea called the marshmallow idea. In 1972, a psychologist named Walter Mischel, I believe he was a psychologist, did an experiment, a very famous marshmallow experiment, where he took a group of 4-year-olds and basically they were given the choice, 1 marshmallow now or 2 later if they could wait for Walter to return from an errand. Then 14 years later, he did a test. He did various tests on the group of children who'd gone through this marshmallow experiment, and the children who, when they were 4, had decided to wait and to delay gratification in order to get 2 marshmallows, they now had, on average, 210 points higher scores on their SATs. They were more confident, more self-reliant, and more able to deal with tests and stress in their life. That average difference in SAT scores, 210, was more than the difference between economically advantaged children and economically disadvantaged children. It was more than the difference between children whose parents dropped out of high school and children whose parents graduated, whose parents had a graduate degree. So the conclusion was that the ability to delay gratification, the willpower to delay gratification, was a great indicator for future success. And the key here being that the idea is that if you can delay gratification and have the willpower to stick on your path and ignore distractions uh, and also surmount obstacles, that is a good indication that you can find success and that you can reach a level of mastery in the things that you do. But this route to mastery also doesn't apply to extreme sports athletes. If you think about what extreme sports are, they are highs, um, they are filled with adrenaline, and um, and most of the people who do, or like all of the people who do extreme sports, you could say, um, are thrill seekers, and that's one of the categories um, that psychologists use to determine if you can delay gratification or you can't. So these, if you are impulsive or not, and so these extreme sport athletes would be in the category of impulsive people. They would have been the children who took one marshmallow now instead of waiting for two, and yet they were achieving such heights in the realm of extreme sports, and yet they were pushing what was possible, what was humanly possible for athletic performance to such heights. Then lastly, we have the the third route to mastery, and that's based on this idea called the musician's idea. In 1990, Anders Ericsson interviewed violinists at the Berlin Academy of Music, and what he found was that what set great musicians apart from good musicians, apart from average musicians, was the amount, the number of hours of practice they put in. And practice, in his definition, was deliberate and measured, where you would identify what your errors were, try and uncover them, and then work to remedy them. And he said that on average, the 20-year-olds who arrived at this academy had put in roughly 10,000 hours of practice, of deliberate practicing. So this is the 10,000 hours rule that I believe Malcolm Gladwell alludes to in his book, or bases his book on. And we see again that well, according to Steven Kotler in his book Rise of Superman, that extreme sports athletes didn't fit this path to mastery. Most extreme sports and adrenaline sports are surrounded by a hedonistic culture of drinking and partying. Many of them put in far less hours than 10,000, and the practice wasn't deliberate. It didn't meet the criteria of Anders Ericsson. It wasn't deliberate, a measured approach of uncovering errors and trying to remedy them. Although, again, with all three of these paths, there will be some extreme sport athletes who came from an encouraging background, who could delay gratification, and that was their major strength, or who had put in roughly 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. But we can see that those couldn't have been the deciding factors, because there were so many of the extreme sports athletes who didn't fit those molds. So then the question is, why did these athletes, why were they why were they increasing their performance at such a rapid rate? Why were they at the limits of what was humanly possible and getting better? How had they mastered these techniques and were improving and making iterations on these skills if they didn't follow the three traditional routes to mastery? There are three reasons that we'll look at. Firstly, flow is autotelic. That means auto meaning self and telic meaning goal. During flow, your brain releases 6 of the most potent neurochemicals that it can. These are pleasure chemicals. That means that activities where you find flow or flow states themselves are highly, highly addictive, meaning that you don't need to motivate yourself to do them. They use the example in the book that you don't need to tell a surfer to wake up if there are barrels in the ocean that morning. So that kind of that offers a counter argument to the necessity of coming from an encouraging background, because flow states are all the motivation you need. They're so addictive in and of themselves. So that's a counter argument to the mother's idea. Then the next idea is linked to what flow is. So one trigger that we will look at in one of the next sections is the circumstances under which flow exists is very particular, and that is the point where the sweet spot between the difficulty of the challenge and your current skill set. So I'll show a nice graph now, and basically for flow only exists where you are doing an activity that is just outside of your current skill set. And we can give an example. So an example would be if you surf a wave. Let's say that wave height is the only factor that determines how difficult a wave is to ride. So let's say you're surfing a 5-foot wave, and you've surfed a wave that size before. You even surfed an 8-foot wave before. Because of the level of difficulty and your current skill set, as I said, you've surfed an 8-foot wave before, you won't be in flow. Then let's use another example, another situation. Say the wave is 20 foot. It's a 20-foot wave. But as I said, the biggest you surf is an 8-foot wave. So in this situation, you also won't be in flow. You'll be anxious. And in the first situation, you would have been bored. It's too easy. But say you surfed a 9-foot wave, and you've surfed an 8-foot before, but you've never surfed a 9-foot wave. That, in this example, could be just the right amount of difficulty for you to be stretching your skills for a flow state to exist. So what this means is that flow only exists where you are just stretching your current skill level. Not enough to snap, not too much, like if you surfed a 20-foot wave, where you would be anxious, and not too little where you'd be bored because you've done it before. So flow only exists at this point where you are increasing your skills. What this means is the second path to mastery we touched on was the marshmallows idea, which is this idea that you need to be able to delay gratification, to have strong enough willpower to work so hard now, knowing that far, far, far in the future will be your reward, and you'll master your skill and benefit from that. But as extreme sports athletes did, and as you do when you engage in an activity that generates flow, you receive the reward now. So it's instant gratification. But the difference with flow activities is flow only exists where you are increasing your skills. So instant gratification is the route to success, is the means, is the vehicle by which you reach that future success. And the difference is that you are getting the gratification and enjoyment now. So that's a good counter argument to the marshmallows idea. Then the third idea is we have this route to mastery, the musician's idea, which says that you need 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to reach mastery. And in his book, Stephen says, are we sure about that? As I've already touched on, he says that a good indicator for learning is whether during the experience is filled with emotion, whether there are many neurochemicals released. And as I said before, in flow states are usually highly emotional experiences, and many neurochemicals are released. So the chances are that the information that we take in during a flow state, during an altered state, is transferred from short-term to long-term memory. So here I thought I could add some examples that might bolster his argument for how flow could decrease the time it takes to master a skill. So in their book, Stealing Fire from the Gods, Jamie and Stephen talk about how the US Marines have these mind gyms set up where they are trying to harness flow to learn skills faster than normal. So one thing they do is they have their soldiers put into sensory deprivation tanks, where you can get rid of distractions and you lose your sense of self because you don't have the senses that you usually would. They entrain their brain waves and they regulate their heart rates. And using these techniques, they have found that they can cut the time it takes to learn foreign languages from 6 months to 6 weeks. Then another example they give, also in Stealing Fire. Is it in Stealing Fire? No, sorry, it's in The Rise of Superman, is a 2011 study by DARPA, the United States Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, said that military snipers trained in flow can acquire their targets faster by a factor of 2.3. So they can acquire their targets in roughly half the time. Another study was done with amateur snipers, where instructors were able to train these snipers from novice level shooting to expert level shooting 50% faster if they were already trained in flow. So these are some small examples of some few examples of how flow can be used to decrease the time it takes to master a skill.